Good morning, everyone. This might be a bit of a downer for so early in the morning. I'll try to keep us all from plunging into total despair by the end of the hour. Thank you, Robin, John, Anne, Margaret, Liaquat, and everyone at the Writers' Conference for bringing us all back together. It's wonderful to be with human beings instead of pixels after almost a year and a half. And it's also an honor to give the David Halberstam lecture. When I was reporting in Iraq, Halberstam's work was the North Star for my generation of reporters. He had already been there in Vietnam. So it's more than humbling to be giving a lecture in his name and in his honor. In 1838, Abraham Lincoln, at age 28, gave a speech on the perpetuation of our political institutions. He asked the question, how might our democracy die? And he concluded that we would never be conquered by some Napoleon from across the sea who would cross the Blue Ridge Mountains and drink from the Ohio River. No, Lincoln said, if destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. He was such a good writer, Lincoln. He was talking about, essentially, he was foreseeing a near-death experience a couple decades later in 1861, and we've had them periodically. I think of 1933 at the depths of the Great Depression as another one, and 1968 when the country was in turmoil over race in Vietnam as another. And I think last year was something of a near-death experience when Americans contemplated suicide. What do I mean by that? First of all, the pandemic exposed and exploited all of our underlying conditions. It showed how deep inequality runs in this country between black and white, between rich and poor, and between a new category, essential and non-essential workers. We hadn't thought of ourselves this way until last year. I immediately knew that I was a non-essential worker because I was sitting on my ass at home all year in front of a laptop. That was the entire professional class: architects, journalists, lawyers, politicians, non-essential. Who were the essential workers? Delivery drivers, supermarket cashiers, warehouse workers, people who had to show up in order for the rest of us to go on living. And they were, by and large, the working class, underpaid, forced to work in difficult conditions, and really to risk their lives on behalf of the rest of us. And there was a brief moment when we became aware that our lives depended on people who were, if we were not in that class, invisible to us. And they became visible and then they disappeared again. But that was one of the dividing lines that the pandemic brought up to the surface. Another that wasn't altogether clear until last year was the division between what I think of as experts and populists. The experts said, follow the science. The populists said, follow the leader. That led to a kind of cultural war between those who wore masks and those who refused to wear masks. I don't think there's another country on earth where the mask became a key political symbol, so that you immediately knew whether the person walking toward you was red or blue, depending on what they had on their face or didn't have on their face. That was a sign of just how polarized this country had become, that something as simple as a mask, which is like a Kleenex or like sneezing into your arm, a simple way to keep yourself and others safe, became a mark of political, even tribal identity. And then there were the largest protests in US history that exploded in the middle of the pandemic and showed that the long history of racial injustice was far from over, and that there was a new generation for whom this became a kind of rallying cry that American society itself was far from making progress, was stuck in a permanent state of injustice. And then almost as a parenthesis, wildfires as you know, here and in California, storms, signs that global warming, for which the pandemic was a kind of trial run, was bearing down on us. By October of last year, I was in a state of utter dread because we had an election coming up. And that election promised to bring violence and perhaps even something we hadn't seen since Fort Sumter, the overthrow of the Constitution, the attempted subversion of democracy. All of this in the space of about 6 months, 8 months. It was an intense year, and we had become the kind of country, or were at least in danger of becoming the kind of country that we used to go out and save. Countries where the political institutions were weakening, where leaders were exploiting the fears and angers of their followers and encouraging violence, encouraging spreading disinformation on a mass scale in order to stoke polarization and violence. By the end of his presidency, Donald Trump had told 30,000 lies, according to the Washington Post. Those lies became, I think, his most enduring legacy, the creation of a sense of unreality in which Americans no longer even seem to be living in the same world, could not agree on the most basic facts about up and down, which it turns out democracy depends on, a shared reality. We no longer had that shared reality. The year ended on January 6th. That was the last day of 2020. With, again, for the first time since Fort Sumter, a violent assault on our political institutions, on the very heart of them, that was a direct blow aimed at the Constitution and at democratic practice by people who no doubt thought they were defending the Constitution and democratic practice because they had fallen under the sway of a leader who told them that the greatest fraud in American history had just been perpetrated. So all of this in 1 year, a year in which, we looked into the abyss. We saved our democracy by the skin of its teeth, by the skin of its teeth. The election showed Americans of all persuasions still believed in democracy. It was the highest turnout in American history on both sides. But it also showed how deeply divided we are. Every election just reinforces the idea that our divisions seem insuperable. And yet we're stuck with each other. We are quarantined together. I know a woman who once said during the pandemic of her own husband and children, they're not the people I would choose to be quarantined with. And that made me feel like maybe that's true of my fellow Americans. Are we all the people we would choose to be quarantined with in one country? We have no choice. We are stuck with each other. And that basic fact, we are all Americans, and yet we look at each other across a divide that seems as vast as the Grand Canyon, and the other side seems not just opposed or wrong, but a threat, an existential threat, each side seeing the other in that way, and yet we're stuck. So during the pandemic, I set about to ask myself, how did this happen? And can we become a country again? How can we become a country again? So that became the mission of writing Last Best Hope. So let's start with how this happened. There have been two big trends in the last half century, and I see the last 40 or 50 years as a kind of discrete epic in which much of what we live with today began and developed. The first trend, the rise of a more diverse, more inclusive, more tolerant America, with immigration from around the world after 1965, and rights movements by disenfranchised groups demanding that they be equal citizens. So we were becoming a multi-everything democracy for the first time in our history. At the same time, the decline of the industrial economy, the rise of the information economy with globalization. And that resulted in increasing inequality on a scale that we haven't seen in over 100 years. And it never seems to relent, no matter who's in office, whether it's a recession or a boom, whether it's war or peace. The idea of America separating into the winners and losers of globalization just has been relentless. And the pandemic accelerated it, as it accelerated all these other trends. So, two things: a more diverse country, a more unequal country. And I would say that those two trends have stoked division and conflict and competition between groups, as there's a sense almost of a zero-sum game, rather than of an expanding economy in which there's room for everyone, and even stoked hatred. So keep those two trends in mind, and they somewhat run counter to each other. More inclusive, more unequal. Both are true. Nations, like individuals, need stories to understand who they are and what they want to become, to create what you could call a moral identity. And I think that the year 2020 showed that we are fractured not just in two, but in four narratives, four ideas about what America is, four moral identities. Now, they all come from the same society, so they're constantly affecting each other, changing into each other, reacting against each other, driving each other to extremes. But remember, they are all part of the same society. It's not as though these are from different worlds. I'm not talking about groups. This is not a portrait of all Americans. This is an account of the four dominant ideas about who we are. The first is what I call Free America. Free America set the political terms for this whole era. It was given its highest rhetorical life by Ronald Reagan. Get government out of your life. Set the people free to go about their own affairs, cut their taxes, deregulate their businesses, open up trade, be a light to the nations, summon the masses of the world to come here because we're a free country, and we will have both broad freedom and broad prosperity, the shining city on the hill. That was Reagan's vision, and it was the most potent of these four narratives. I think it really set the terms for the next half century. It began in the 70s, came into power in the 80s. It's still with us, but it has changed, as you'll see, because its promise was never met. Instead, I think it led to a hollowing out of government, which we saw last year very dramatically when our public health departments were overwhelmed by the pandemic because of years of systematic disinvestment. And it created classes of Americans who lived more and more separate lives, with fortunes accumulating at the top that were unimaginable, and with whole areas of the country, mainly the old industrial and rural areas, falling behind, so that it became common, once you drove out of a city, immediately to start encountering abandoned malls, main streets with all the local businesses closed up, and a sense of growing despair. So Free America promised that if only government got out of the way, we would all rise, and instead some rose and many did not. And as its promises failed, the idea of Free America became a kind of orthodoxy. It was really the orthodoxy of the Republican Party, and yet Republican voters weren't experiencing the benefits of that orthodoxy. So there was a kind of internal collision going on within that side of America between the elite of the party, who to this day repeat the mantra of Free America like a cargo cult: lower taxes, deregulate, set the economy free, wages will go up, jobs will increase. The data don't prove it. In fact, they almost prove the opposite over the years. But that's the mantra. The second narrative, and you'll see that there's a chronology here, is what I call smart America. That's the educated professionals. That's the meritocracy. That's the idea that if you work hard and pursue an education and get the right kind of education, the information economy will welcome you and you will be one of the winners of the age of globalization. I think of this as Bill Clinton's America. Education became the key answer to all social problems under Clinton. And the Democratic Party became the party of educated professionals. They became kind of the heart of the party, which is along, of course, with non-white Americans who had become Democrats as a result of the civil rights movement and other factors, including a Republican Party that not only didn't welcome them, but scapegoated them. But it was a strange turn for the Democrats because it had been the party of the working class, the blue-collar party, from Roosevelt onward. In the 90s, it changed. And in the year 2000, Bill Clinton gave a speech at the White House that was just exultant because everything seemed to be going right. And he said, the internet will free more people from poverty than anything in human history, which was maybe at the time a plausible thought. Today, it seems almost insane to think of the internet freeing people from poverty. Because if anything, the internet has been a force for inequality by replacing jobs and by concentrating wealth. But smart America believed in a meritocracy that ceased to be a meritocracy. More and more, you are born a meritocrat rather than rising into the meritocracy on your own ability. Why is that? Because families have a family business. The family business is success. The pressure put on children of meritocrats to stay in the family business, not to fall out, is intense. Just think of the most important event in the life cycle of many families, which is college applications. The amount of tension and anxiety and self-reproach that goes into what actually seems like kind of, not that important an event, maybe shouldn't be that important, shows how so much had been concentrated on the idea of you have to get into the right college in order to continue the family business, in order to continue that path. And yet, it is no easier today for a poor American to get into a top college than it was in 1954. In other words, after half a century of expanding opportunity and expanding admissions and more and more of a sense that this is the only way to a successful life, we are no more truly an equal opportunity country when it comes to that than we were half a century ago. So meritocracy was a system for equal opportunity that has become a system for inequality. And I think most meritocrats know that, and they go to a lot of trouble not to know it, because it's an uncomfortable truth, that this has become a kind of special class, the educated. It votes in a special way, it has a special way of dressing, of eating, of dealing with children, of thinking about education, of thinking about college. It spends a lot of time planning children's activities and touring colleges with children. There's a kind of intense family center to this class that shows that it has a special status in our society. The third narrative I want to talk about is what I call real America. That phrase comes from a Sarah Palin quote from 2008. During the campaign, she said, "We believe that the best of America is in these small towns that we get to visit, and in these wonderful little pockets of what I call the real America, being here with all you hardworking, very patriotic, pro-American areas of this great nation." Remember, this is how she spoke. Those who are running our factories and teaching our kids and growing our food and fighting our wars for us. So Palin, who we've almost forgotten, I think was a truly key figure in the last half century because first she articulated this narrative very succinctly in that passage. There are real Americans and there are fake Americans. Real Americans live in small towns, rural areas, they work with their hands. She didn't say this, but we know they're white, they're Christian, and they're not the well-educated. That's who is real. And they're patriotic. And that's a key point that I'll come back to. Palin introduced a new kind of politics, what I think of as white identity politics. Of course, white politics was the default politics of American history from the beginning. White identity politics was a new thing. It became a kind of conscious reaction to what I described as the rising diversity of a multi-everything democracy. It was in reaction to that she embodied something. It was not her ideas, it was certainly not her experience, it was her identity. Many of our leaders have come from the working class, but Sarah Palin belonged to the working class. She embodied it in the way she dressed, in the way she talked, her vernacular, her glasses. Everything about her suggested a certain type of person, a certain class of person, which electrified voters. I talked to a lot of people who, in Ohio, during the 2008 campaign, and it was clear that what they loved was not John McCain and the orthodoxy of free America, more tax cuts, more free trade. What they loved was Sarah Palin and her identity as a real American. But real America leads us directly to Trump. Palin was Trump's John the Baptist. Trump rose to the height of power on the basis of that narrative that was introduced years earlier by Palin, namely that there are some Americans who are real and who will make us great again, and there are others who not only aren't real but are threats. Who are they? The elites, the experts, the well-educated, as Trump saw them, and the people in the cities, blacks, browns, immigrants, those who don't look like real Americans. So there's threats coming from different sides, and Trump stoked the anxieties that those threats produced and gained great power through them. Trump was not a fascist. He was a very Native American creature, something Mark Twain would have recognized immediately. He was a demagogue. And here's one description by a political theorist of what that means. Trump is a creature native to our own style of government, and therefore much more difficult to protect ourselves against. He is a demagogue, a popular leader who feeds on the hatred of elites that grows naturally in democratic soil. In other words, we're always at risk from someone like Trump because democracy tells people you are the rulers, you rule yourselves. When a class of elites seems to be rising and ruling over you, smart America, that produces this resentment that a demagogue can exploit. He's a natural product of democratic soil. And finally, the last narrative and the most recent is what I call just America. That was the narrative that took the streets last summer. It's a generational narrative. I think it came in with the millennials who were a large and influential but also discontented generation who looked at the world their parents had promised them and did not see sunny optimism. They saw the difficulty of getting jobs in the professional world that they had been educated for, the financial crisis, the recession, above all, global warming, and the repeated proof that we are not a racially just society through viral videos of police brutality. So Just America, I think, rebelled, just as Real America was a kind of rebellion against free and smart, against the idea of the elites ruling. Just America was also a rebellion against smart America. It was almost a family rebellion, children against their parents, because it really found itself in that world. And it saw America not as slowly, gradually, but inevitably on the road to the more perfect union that Barack Obama talked about. Instead, a static society, a caste society that didn't change much over 200 or 300 years, with groups of oppressors in power over groups of oppressed. That in that basic hierarchy is unchanging for all the improvements in both living conditions and laws passed. Somehow it never got at the heart of the problem. They were pointing to the straight line from slavery to segregation to the second-class life of many Black Americans today. This is something most white Americans have never wanted to think about. Just America forced it into the open. But it took a turn that I think was a kind of dead end. It became, and this happened almost in front of our eyes last summer, rather than a movement that could change the conditions of life, could actually improve conditions for the disadvantaged and the disenfranchised, it became a kind of revolution in consciousness, a cultural revolution. It happened in our cultural institutions, in academia, in the arts, philanthropy, in media, where I work. It was intense, it was revolutionary, and it was one generation, in a sense, coming to overthrow the previous one. But it did not offer a way to change the actual conditions of lives. And in fact, in some ways, because I think it concentrated in the professional world, it misunderstood the working class, which we saw again and again in elections. When Joe Biden, the most moderate of candidates, won the nomination because of Black working class voters. When Eric Adams in New York a couple of weeks ago won the Democratic nomination because of a mix of Black, brown, and white working class voters, and yet he, far from wanting to defund the police, was promising to ramp up policing while also reforming its abuses. So in some ways, I think Just America lost touch with the way most ordinary Americans think and feel and vote. Those are the four narratives that I see as dominating my adult life. And I don't really want to live in the republic of any of them. So I ask myself, what would be a better way? Which leads to the question, do we have a national identity? And in a perverse way, the last year showed us that we do, because it relieved us of the burden of having to be the exceptional nation. No one thinks of us that way anymore. If anything, we're pitied by countries around the world. Taiwan, the UN, and Russia offered to send us humanitarian aid as if we were Bosnia, not the United States. It was humiliating, but it also, I think, took off that burden of having to be a universal country. Instead, we had to look at ourselves. The entire year I had the sense that there was a mirror in front of us. It didn't show a lot of things I loved, but it did show that we have certain national traits. And randomly, what are they? We use first names. And by the way, foreigners immediately recognize Americans no matter who they vote for, where they come from, what their color, what their gender. They know we're Americans. By what? Our loud voices, our friendliness and openness, our naivete, our arrogance, our cluelessness about complex social interactions and social webs in countries with more elaborate systems than ours, our crass but quite available popular culture, and I could go on, and in the book I do list quite a few of these traits. What do they all show? I think what they show is what Tocqueville called the passion for equality. Not necessarily the ideal of equality, but the desire and the sense that I should be as good as anyone else, that I should be able to talk to anyone else on equal terms, that I should be able to go into any world. Nothing should be closed off to me. Tocqueville said, and this is really quite striking, Equality is the ardent, insatiable, eternal, and invincible desire of Americans. More than freedom. More than freedom. He said, nothing is more wonderful than the art of being free, but nothing is harder to learn how to use than freedom. Freedom is an art. It's a skill. Being able to govern yourself is a set of acquired habits and talents and skills. It is not natural. It is easily lost. Equality is a passion. It's primal. It's why our billionaires wear jeans with holes in them, to show that actually they're equal. They're not trying to be better. It's why we're suspicious of intellectual heirs, because it suggests some kind of special class. So equality is the most striking thing about this country, the desire for it. And I think it connects us all the way through our history. Of course, we have never been an equal country. We have been a radically unequal country. We all know that. But it doesn't change the fact that the desire for equality is always there, and it accounts for our conflict. It accounts for our conflict. When equality is denied to whole groups, there are countries where there are groups that are in permanent subordinate positions without social conflict. Not here. Inequality leads to conflict here. So I want to float a trial balloon as I end here for a different narrative that I would call Equal America. And it's a narrative that I think can connect our past to our future and make room for more of us than those other four narratives, and not set us into winners and losers as each of those four does. By Equal America, I don't mean absolute equality of outcomes. That has never been on the table in this country. Even Eugene Debs, the great American socialist, worshipped Abraham Lincoln, who was the champion of the self-made man. By equality, I mean equality of status, of rights, of opportunities, a sense of shared citizenship. And in our history, when this sense disappears, when inequality destroys that, and equality is the only basis under which we Americans feel that we can share citizenship, because we don't have the blood and soil to connect us. We only have our equality as citizens. When that disappears, we no longer can govern ourselves. We lose the art, as Tocqueville called it, the art of self-government. So there are two things that have to happen, and they're inextricable. One is we have to create conditions of greater equality, and the other is we have to acquire the ability to govern ourselves again, which we've lost. The pandemic proved that. And I'm not going to get into some of the policy ideas that I list at the end of the book, partly because we're running out of time, and partly because they're not original. I'm not a policy thinker. I don't come up with brilliant fixes for how to make education more equal. But I do know that unless we can do certain things about inequality in this country, unless we can restore the safety net and empower workers who have been systematically disempowered over the last 40 years, and break up the concentrations of corporate power that have become monopolies. We have an economy now of monopoly, which is a major source of inequality. And make education closer to the dream of equal opportunity than it is, because today education is a force for inequality, and the pandemic proved it. Families with means were able to survive it. Families without means, their children were destroyed. It was an incredible thing that we as a country allowed that to happen last year. If we can do those things, we can begin, I think, to create a society in which Americans can look at each other as equals and can feel that the citizenship belongs to all of us, that we share it. But on the other side, we have to relearn how to govern ourselves. And I would say two very simple things. One, journalists, me, need to be more like Larry Wright, who's sitting here. That is to say, we need to remember that Twitter is not journalism, and that building your own brand and making your own tribe love you and trashing the other tribe doesn't add to our knowledge of the world. In fact, we're losing our knowledge of the world because local news is disappearing. And instead, there's so many incentives now for journalists simply to become celebrities and to pose and to become sort of figures that people look to. And that's a terrible mistake. So journalists need to remember that they are a key part of self-government, but the role they play should be to remake the shared reality that we've lost. And the other thought I have about this is that we need to find ways to be together again. It's so unlikely that you'll even cross paths with someone you deeply disagree with. We found all sorts of ways to live apart. Geographically, we've separated almost county by county. We watch different cable shows, etc. So how do we do that? It's key to creating citizens who can listen, who can debate, who can argue, who can disagree without fighting, without turning to violence, and who can learn to compromise and even cooperate in order to solve common problems. So my totally unoriginal idea is a year of national service for all Americans under 25. Not necessarily military service, of course, civilian service, the Civilian Conservation Corps that Roosevelt created. Why can't we have that in order to begin to have a generation that is more aware of global warming than my generation to combat the effects of it together with young Americans from completely different backgrounds? We need, almost like what we have done in places like Northern Ireland and Bosnia, to consciously bring together the warring tribes in order to get them to solve a problem together. Not a huge political problem, because that's just more conflict. Small problems, local problems, problems that they have in common. Each of the other four narratives will have to sacrifice something for us to get to equal America. Free America will have to give up the long run of triumphant capital over beleaguered labor. Smart America, the new aristocrats will have to stop seeing themselves as a privileged class. Real America will have to stop rejecting the other as un-American. Just America will have to abandon what I think of as the metaphysics of group identity. And in the end, all of this leads to a word that a lot of people are uncomfortable with, which is patriotism. Patriotism is a basic emotion that most people feel. And if you lose it in yourself or shy away from it, it will be taken by the most destructive narratives. We've seen that. We've seen that, where the American flag symbolizes something that you almost recoil from sometimes when you know what it really means. But I think of patriotism not as nationalism, not as aggressiveness and superiority, but as basic loyalty and love. It's like family loyalty. It's a basic human emotion of loyalty to what is yours. And without it, we cannot solve our problems. Without the national solidarity that patriotism can produce, we will not slow global warming in this country. We will not end racism or reverse inequality or save our democracy. We can't do it simply by insisting on our group's way. We have to do it as in common as Americans. Without it, there is no motive for getting to work, for following Langston Hughes's exhortation, make America again. Nobody will save us but ourselves. Self-government puts all the responsibility in our hands. No strongman or expert or privileged class or algorithm is going to do it for us. Democracy asks us to place more faith in ourselves and one another than we can bear. On some days, the project seems preposterous and the effort exhausting. But for Americans, there is no escape. We've never known any other life. We have to make this one. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, George. We've got some time for some questions. There are volunteers with microphones in the aisles. Please raise your hands high. I should add that the microphones are wiped down after each question, so all very safe. So please, whoever, please raise your hands, and I will find there's one here. And is there a microphone? Anybody? Yeah, keep your hand up, please. Thank you. This gentleman first, and then you, sir. Go ahead. Thanks.
Good morning, George. Could you talk about civic education in America and how that could provide a rebirth of democracy and a rebirth of patriotism and tolerance and common experience?
Yeah, thank you, Larry Diamond, for that question. That was like a pitcher who's got like a fastball and you know it's coming your way. Civic education, when I was a kid, was very straightforward. It was, these are the three branches of government, here's how a bill becomes a law. And then it disappeared. And it disappeared because schools were afraid that it would generate conflict. As we became more polarized, civic education began to die out from our middle and high schools. And we can't live without it, but I don't think it can be what it was in the 50s and 60s. It cannot be the basics of the Constitution. We need, of course, to teach that, but what we really need to teach is the skills of self-government, which, as I've said, are not natural. In fact, they're unnatural. Human history has a tiny little blip in which they became the main form of government, and it appears that that blip may be closing. So what are the skills? The ability to argue and to bring evidence to your argument and to bring evidence that is capable of convincing. The ability to listen. That's what journalists really at their best do, is listen, and it's what citizens have to do. The ability to find areas of common ground when there's very little, but where the common ground might begin to build outward. There's a new report out that I think Larry might have had some involvement in called Educating for American Democracy, that is a blueprint not for what to teach, but how to teach. How to bring civics back into classrooms so that it doesn't become a club in the hands of red or blue America, but becomes a tool for giving young citizens the skills of self-government. It's already, of course, being torn to pieces by the right and the left, but it's there, and I think that's an essential part of what I'm talking about.
Great. Gentleman up there, yeah.
First of all, thank you. Your framing of the four narratives really resonates with me. We're probably similar age. I wanted to, I also want to be optimistic, but I'm wondering, in coming up with your closing synthesis, if you looked at history or other societies or other examples of times when nations have gone through similar turmoil, and whether you have any lessons there.
I mean, our own history has these repeated examples that I cited earlier of near suicide, the biggest of them being the Civil War. And we've always stepped back from the brink or fought our way back from the brink. That doesn't mean we ended up in the right place, because as we all know, the Civil War did not lead to equal America. It led to the possibility of more equal America, but then came Jim Crow. So there's no straight road to the promised land. It's much more cyclical. But I do think, I read a lot about the 1850s while I was working on Last Best Hope. There are frightening resonances with today. The rhetoric, the use of polarizing language and dehumanizing language by elites, political and media elites, in order to drive people apart even more than they are. Sometimes it's not as though these divisions aren't real, but when your life is mediated through cable news or Twitter or other websites, it seems as if we are about to all start shooting each other. And so it's worrying that so many of our elites are willing to push us to that brink for their own purposes. And there's no blueprint for how to avoid it except I think the first thing is just to acknowledge it could happen here. It could happen here. It's a shock. Everything about the last, in some ways, 20 years, starting with 9/11, has been a series of shocks that has left us today deeply aware that we are not an exceptional nation, that everything that happens elsewhere can happen here. But being aware of that, and knowing what the consequences are by looking at other countries that have disintegrated into warring political factions, should be a sobering moment in order to at least restrain oneself and think of ways to step back and find a better path.
Thanks. Another question down here to the left.
Yeah. Could you share your thoughts with us about the debates now about critical race theory education and the pushback at some states? Well, I believe Idaho is one of the states that's now legislated about this. So you're in Idaho, and then as a corollary to that, the visions of American history that are on one pole on the 1619 project,
Yep.
and the other one on the 1776
The
Commission.
1776 project, yeah. I mean, first of all, I'm totally opposed to state legislatures passing laws that are speech codes, that are restrictions on speech. Even in secondary schools where the state has some authority over what can be taught or what should be taught, these codes are anti-democratic, and they are they're a political move in order to stoke exactly the anger and division that we've been talking about this morning. They're not serving a higher purpose at all, and I think they're all deeply divisive. They say they're against teaching division. They are divisive. They are divisive. But it's not as though there's nothing real beneath them, because as a public school parent, I know that there is a trend in education in some, certainly not all, but some American schools that is teaching not critical race theory, which is a very interesting, complex set of ideas from the 70s and 80s, pioneered by Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw. That is an academic and a powerful academic set of ideas. This is something else, which is what I think of as the metaphysics of group identity, where our identity is our essence. The accidents of our birth become our essence and become the way of understanding everything in our society and about ourselves. And I think when that becomes a dogma, as it has in some schools and in some parts of our culture, I think it doesn't, first of all, it's not healthy to have our children being given a dogma that they are not allowed to think outside. It's not teaching them how to think, it's teaching them what to think. And second, I think it's unconnected to the way people experience their lives, which is far more fluid and dynamic and varied and mixed than the simple ideas of this approach to education. So I'm uneasy with some trends in our culture and in our education, but I am hostile to the Republican state legislatures that want to ban certain ideas, because I think what they really want to do is stoke division and return us to a narrative of race in this country that was never true and that was a destructive lie.
Got time for one more question. There's a woman right here in the middle aisle. That's Catherine. There you go.
Thank you for your wonderful framework. It gives us a wonderful way to be able to think about the divisions in the country. But you only mentioned the internet once with reference to Bill Clinton and talking about poverty. And I'm wondering, in fact, I know, we all know that the internet and social media has served to foster the divisions that you have outlined today. How do we harness the ill effects of the internet without abrogating our right to free speech?
Yeah, that's a very complicated subject. And,
I know.
And maybe one for someone with more expertise. The internet was supposed to make us more free and more equal. That was the promise. Everyone would have a platform, everyone had access to the information that they'd been deprived of, everyone could speak. And yeah, that has happened, but it turns out not to be an unalloyed good. Why? Because in letting in all the information, it lets in a great deal of false information, and human beings do not have the equipment, to each of us, to separate out truth from lies, improbable conspiracies from historical facts. So instead, we've become prey to disinformation on a scale that we thought was only something that Russians suffered from. That's another way in which we've joined the world. We have become more like the rest of the world. I mean, I guess there are two ways of dealing with social media. One is to tell the social media companies to regulate them as publishers, not as utilities. They're one or the other. Right now, they're getting the benefits of both. They are free to publish whatever they want without suffering any consequences, which is not true of a publisher, where libel and other laws come into play. But they're also these unregulated utilities that are essential for our lives, but that have no constraints the way the electric company or the phone company have constraints on how they can deal with their customers. So it's all up to them. And they have showed a total failure to be able to regulate themselves because it's unprofitable to regulate yourself. So one or the other. I don't know which, and maybe there's a third way. But right now, as a journalist who peeks at Twitter but doesn't write on Twitter, I know I've seen the best minds of my generation destroyed by social media, and it has not been a positive thing in the world of journalism. It could have been, but instead it's taken the energy that should go to reporting on local and instead turns everyone into a carnival barker.
George, thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you.
I don't know about you all, but for all the grim tidings, I can't but feel heartened by George's passionate, patriotic analysis of our country. So signing books up at the bookstore tent now, and then we'll break for breakouts. Tobias Wolff will be here at 11, and the other 3 breakouts will be in the other tents. Thanks so much.